So I'm not going to go through. You can scroll through the different PowerPoints. It's 15, 16, and 18 are the three that have to do with the battles of World War II. I will just point out a couple of big kind of concepts. First off, that right after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese pushed pretty far. Take over the Philippines from the United States. You have the Bataan Death March, and kind of the horrible treatment of American and British soldiers there. If you've ever watched the movie Pearl Harbor, it talks a little bit about the Doolittle Raid. And the Doolittle Raid will kind of cause Japan to sort of, dig in. It'll stop their expansion. One of the big aspects, one of the big reasons why the United States is successful in World War II is going to be largely because of kind of cryptology. They're able to break the code, the Japanese code, the British break the German code. And yet the Japanese are not ever able to break the American code because we use the Navajo language. And so that's going to be a big reason why the U.S. is successful. Another battle you want to be aware of is the Battle of Midway. That is seen as a turning point. The breaking of codes is part of why we're successful there. And so the U.S. will sink like 5 Japanese ships. And given that the resource issues that Japan has, they're going to have a hard time coming back from that. The U.S. pretty quickly gets control of the Atlantic. We're making all that military stuff, and we're able to get it overseas. And you start to have the U.S. and Britain planning, kind of going into Africa, North Africa. They're going to kind of come up through Italy. It's also about this time that you have Hitler deciding that he wants to invade the Soviet Union, which is a huge mistake on his part. And that's going to really kind of lead to the Germans really that really is kind of the fateful decision, although it takes them a couple more years to realize what a bad idea that was. So the U.S. invades North Africa. Takes us a while to get a foothold there. Pretty tough fighting, but we do eventually manage to do that. And we begin with the Casablanca Conference, the plan to attack Italy, kind of go up through that part of Europe. And so we'll go up through there. Then once you get kind of, you come from 1942 going into 1943, we begin significant bombing campaigns. We come up through Italy. That's a really difficult fight. The Germans kind of hold us off about midway through that boot. And so you just kind of have this kind of continuous, lots of men having to get off of these boats to take these beach landings. It's from here that you have the Tehran Conference. The Tehran Conference begins to lay the foundation for some of these agreements, right? They agree to an international peacekeeping organization, which is going to be kind of the origin of the United Nations. The Soviets agree to help defeat Japan once Germany's done. And you also have the initial decision to break apart Germany to keep it from being able to kind of reunify right away. And then you have the initial plans for kind of the D-Day invasion. So as we're going into 1944, you still have the Nazis in control of a big chunk of Europe. But it's into this that you're going to start having the planning for Operation Overlord, D-Day, the Normandy invasion. That's going to be, if you've ever seen Saving Private Ryan, huge moment. June 5th through 7th, the weather finally breaks. Eisenhower decides to go in on June 6th. And of course, the big one is going to be that Omaha Beach is where the Americans really face huge, lots of firepower. The Germans are kind of up there on the cliffs. It makes it very difficult to get a foothold on the beach. So you can kind of see that several, there's if you watch the Our Century, America's Time, it talks about this. Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers, any of those talk about that. So you can kind of look through. You will have the United States pushing back the Japanese in the Pacific, doing the island hopping campaign, trying to push them, trying to get them off. So you can kind of see what I mean. There's island hopping, getting closer to Japan, coming up to push them out of the Philippines. Again, Navajo code talkers, pretty big part of that. And so this is what you see this kind of idea of getting closer, trying to get air bases so they can have sustained bombing of Japan. So that the fighting in the Pacific is pretty tough. It takes a long time. By October of 44, the U.S. will manage to get a foothold in the Philippines. And so really by the time you get to 1944, after D-Day, after Leyte Gulf, you have, the Americans in particular, and the Allies generally, really on the verge of success, right? Now, you're still going to have, going through the summer and fall of 44, the U.S. is marching through France. They do liberate Paris. It's rough fighting. It's hedgerow fighting. They're crossing these kind of walls of like brush and undergrowth that in France they use to divide up pastures and farmland. And it's really hard to know when you cross one of those what's on the other side. So it's pretty difficult, right? And so the U.S. kind of gets control of most of France, but then in December of 44, the Nazis try to push back. You have a horrible, horrible winter, the Battle of Bastogne. And so that's a pretty significant pushback. It's the last gasp, really, of the Nazis. Things will, not go well from there on. The U.S. will push in, U.S. and the British will push in from the west. The Soviets are pushing in from the east. It's really the beginning of the end. In February of 45, you have the last conference that Roosevelt's at. That's the Yalta Conference. They basically come to some agreements on liberating European nations, disarming Germany, putting it into zones, and kind of creating the United Nations. So in many ways, we kind of consider that the Yalta Conference is sort of, it's kind of the beginning of the Cold War in a way, although they probably didn't see it that way at the time, largely because of this decision about dividing Germany. So you have, by April of 45, Hitler's committed suicide. The Soviets have taken over. They've surrendered. So you do have the victory in Europe by May 7th. FDR dies in April of 45. Harry Truman becomes president. And so Harry Truman will be the president as World War II is wrapping up. As we're going into 1945, the fighting in the Pacific gets harsher and harsher. You have the battle for Iwo Jima, which is this volcanic island. And one thing about the Pacific campaigns, the closer you got to Japan, the higher the casualty rates were. And that's an important concept because otherwise, when we think about the atomic bomb, it's easy for people to say, well, oh, he shouldn't have dropped the atomic bomb. But when you consider how high the casualty rates were getting the closer you got to Japan, that's a big part for why that decision is going to be made. And the Japanese had been preparing their people to fight. So it's this Battle of Iwo Jima that's memorialized with the Marines. And then, of course, once we get Iwo Jima, we're able to start these B-29 attacks on a regular basis using napalm, creating this firebombing. So that's another part of the atomic bomb debate. We've been dropping this firebombing, and that had been killing thousands of people, right? So we'd already been kind of, causing mass civilian casualties. But as we're getting into the spring of 45, Japan's really struggling. They're running out of resources. This is when the kamikaze attacks begin. And so shortly after that is going to be the attack on Okinawa, where we're going to use that as a base for the invasion. Again, increasing casualties, really, really tough fighting. And so the U.S. is going to begin to talk about the Japanese surrendering. Now, the emperor is actually a little more amenable to that. The military, however, refuses to allow the surrender. So that's when you're going to have the decision to drop the atomic bomb. Now, in July of 45, you have the Potsdam Conference. Again, this is kind of seen as the beginning of the Cold War. Truman is there with Stalin and Churchill, talking about the way the world's going to look after the war. However, Stalin and Truman don't get along. And Stalin has not declared war on Japan like he had promised. And the Soviets are not letting people in Eastern Europe vote, and they're, kind of being awful towards the people in like Czechoslovakia and Poland and such. And so you also have debates about reparation payments to the Soviet Union. And Truman does not tell Stalin about the atomic bomb, although actually we know now that Stalin knew we were working on something. So there's just a whole level of distrust that's taking place with the Potsdam Conference. The atomic bomb, its origins are with the Manhattan Project. I've mentioned this before. Actually begins being developed in 1939, finally tested in July of 45. So you'll have Truman making the decision to drop it in order to protect protect us from American casualties. And so you have this decision to drop the bomb on August 6th, and then another one on August 9th. And this will lead to the victory over Japan Day, which is August 15th. And so that gets us to kind of the end of World War II. You do have the creation of the United Nations. It begins in 1944, where countries meet in Washington, D.C. The Bretton Woods Agreement is shortly after this. And so you kind of have this system that's created after World War II in order to prevent another global conflict, right? It's meant to keep peace. You have the Security Council, the General Assembly, and all of that is meant to kind of keep a check on these kind of global ambitions to prevent this. This period of international cooperation is a big part of what you see the United States aiming for after World War II, whether it has to do with trade or has to do with military stuff. Now, of course, the Cold War is going to infringe on that. You do have an awareness of human rights that comes out of World War II. When you have the Nuremberg trials, putting the Nazis on trial, we put some of the Japanese leaders on trial as well. And so World War II is going to lay the foundation for the world as we know it. Places in the Middle East, the tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. We'll be talking about the Iron Curtain, NATO, those places. And the U.S. will emerge as a world leader. Whether it's World War I and the whole idea of the 14 points and the U.S. really kind of taking the lead there, or whether it's World War II and the U.S. taking the lead with the United Nations, you definitely see that the U.S. becomes this global power and really kind of begins to redefine how the world functions. And so this kind of gives you an idea. We're talking about the different zones, the British zone, the French zone, the American zone. This is the Soviet zone. Berlin's in the middle of that. Berlin, as the capital of Germany, kind of mirrors the other divisions. And that's kind of how you end up with some of these Cold War concepts, right? That you have the United States embracing this idea of partitioning. You have this increasing tension, anxiety about communism, this determination of spheres of influence between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And a lot of this is going to lead to things like the Marshall Plan, a huge investment by the United States in Western Europe. You're going to see this idea of NATO, the Atlantic Pact. You've got the Truman Doctrine, these things that are meant to kind of maintain maintain democracy throughout the globe, right? So this becomes this big tension between the Soviet system and the American system. Weapons, atomic bombs are a big concern over bomb shelters, that sort of thing. And then, of course, we'll talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis and those kinds of things. So I just wanted to point out some of this Cold War concept. There is a separate inquiry that talks about the Cold War, but you need to connect that part of what's going to set us up for the Cold War is going to be the concern about the Soviet Union being aggressive, right? So, again, the world wars lead to the U.S. being a global power. In both of these conflicts, you have this kind of all-in mentality, this notion of everything, every resource we have. And this was particularly true in World War II. And you've got the fact that they try to set up a system of international cooperation, but of course it's not going to last very long, in part because of the Cold War and the tensions that emerged there. So kind of gives you that kind of big kind of 1,000-foot view of what's happening. You can go back through the PowerPoints and look through that. I've shared some optional video links, and I'll have my lecture video posted here just to kind of help you kind of navigate through this. But the reading in American Yawp should make it pretty clear. So if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, that's it.